and welcome to Healing Solidarity, the conference about reimagining international development. I'm Marianne Clements, the initiator of this conference, a writer and consultant and facilitator of the Replenishment Room. And this interview is with Pontso Mafethe, who's been a friend and colleague of mine for many years now. As you hear in this talk, she defines herself as an African feminist, and she's worked for many years on women's rights and philanthropy. In this conversation, we talk together about resisting hierarchy, why we should be skeptical about the archetype of the happy native, and the differences between social movements and NGOs. I hope you'll enjoy this talk as much as I enjoyed having it. I'm here with Pontso Mafethe. Pontso defines herself as a typical frontline child, so born in exile in Zambia to parents with heritages from Zimbabwe, South Africa and Mozambique, schooled in Botswana and Zimbabwe. She's lived and worked across the world, and her life's work is fundamentally African feminism. And then in her spare time, she's learning to fly helicopters, loves street art and thinks there's a place for it in the feminist movement. And her favourite music genre is South African township tech. So I'm going to ask for some recommendations about that before we finish.
I would be happy to.
But just to get us started, so you describe yourself as an African feminist, and I just wanted to start there and ask you, what does that definition mean for you?
For me, I lost my father when I was very young, at 18 months, and was brought up by my mum. And I always remember when I was very young, because my mother was born into a family had 9 siblings.
Okay.
And she was the youngest girl. And it always struck me in terms of family decision-making, family consultations on big things. She was always the one with the least importance. Her voice was always the one that was requested last. And her opinions were the ones which seemed to have the least weight in the ultimate decisions that were made. And it always struck me as a girl who was in a home where my opinions were sought and valued, that in a family context, my mother seemed less important than the others. So growing up, it was very much about, at home, feeling like I had value, I was recognised and was allowed to explore who I was.
Yeah.
But in the family situation, feeling like a girl born to the last girl was the least important. And yet there was no difference between me and anybody else. So it was about initially understanding why that was. And then as I grew up and understood it a bit more, it was wanting to say, actually, what is this about? Why is it? And what can we do to make sure that actually as a family, as a community, as a country and as a world, we can do to make sure that we are not neglecting, ignoring, oppressing half of those who have the same aims about all reaching their potential.
It's kind of like anti-hierarchy or something. It's like...
Yes.
Right?
I'm not a fan of hierarchies. I feel that there is a real value in understanding where thoughts and conversations are had, and how consensus is reached. But I think the position of very top down, and I think the context in which I grew up, very top down, a legacy of colonialism, which was the ultimate top down, which I think is manifested. So it is something around actually who has what to say and how can it contribute for the best end.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you spent a lot of your career working in kind of development settings. And how does that kind of distaste for hierarchy, which I totally salute, how does it kind of show up in those settings for you?
I would say, I just to start say that I got into, if that's the word, the phrase, into development slightly by accident.
Yeah, me too.
It happens, doesn't it? You're like, oh, I care about these things. I need a job. Oh, that looks like it can fit with my values.
Absolutely.
And I think that is why, for many years the sector has, been populated by folks who come in because they feel an injustice about something.
Yeah.
I think, in relation to hierarchies, and I think there are it plays out in a number of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So in a traditional UK development organisation, you have a very, I would argue, quite traditional structure where you have a chief executive officer, a team of directors, a team of senior management, middle management, and then, the rest of us.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that really struck me, I came from Zimbabwe from having managed a regional program. And when I say regional, I mean across Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And I had managed multi-million-pound budgets, had interactions. Part of my role was sort of advocacy with government on some quite contentious issues around conservation and environmental management.
Yeah.
And I thought I had experiences that would, give me access to opportunities in the UK sector, because I come from the continent where a great deal of work is being implemented.
Yeah.
And I had experience. So I was a woman, I was an African, and I came with what I felt was relevant experience. The UK sector for me was an incredibly difficult sector to get into, to get employment in.
Mm-hmm.
And this day, having got into it, it feels like the context hasn't changed. And I'm going slightly roundabout to say that I think, inevitably, we're in the UK, the bulk of the workforce is, white UK.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is something about how they identify the cultural, the contextual, and the different priorities that come from people from other communities, other countries, other continents.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about maybe recruiting what you feel you can see yourself in, recognizing the language, the ways of working, the behaviors, which might be why there is such limited diversity, I would say, particularly in the UK grant making sector.
Yeah.
So the decisions are made at the top by people who are absolutely very committed, and who, absolutely support the ends of the development sector, but come at it, I think, from a very particular perspective.
Yeah.
And they have all the power. And I think that trickles downwards and is reflected in the way decisions are made, the cultures and behaviours of organisation, and I think makes it not necessarily an attractive place for diverse communities to join.
And what I think is really interesting about that as well, because I definitely see it too, but is that, like, when I was at university, whatever, 20 something years ago, and I was reading anthropology, we read stuff about, the anthropology of development, and people talking about, like, this sort of stuff can never be effective unless you take, people's views and voices into account, unless it reflects the communities where you're trying to do work much more effectively. And I feel like we've sort of tried, or in some way we sort of pay lip service to that, but like somehow our structures and our ways of working haven't even caught up with what people were saying 25 years ago, let alone the reality of the world now, which has shifted a lot as well in terms of how we communicate and do things. So it feels like this very outdated, really, model that borrows from I guess from business, or maybe it's just from, British culture, or even like you said, like a colonial culture or something. that doesn't really feel fit for purpose to me a lot of the time, you know.
I agree. I was reading something yesterday about, I think it was an article, and I should credit the author, but the name has escaped me. And I think the title of the article was something like, "Can international non-governmental organisations be part of social movements?"
Yeah, okay.
And I think, I thought actually there's another, the crux of the matter in that, because if you are an organisation that is receiving significant amounts of your income from a quite statutory source, you are to a great extent beholden to that financial source.
Yeah.
I think by their very nature, and in my experience, social movements are not structured in the traditional ways that can accommodate somewhat strict, rigid rules of engagement.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen is that some organisations or entities within the social movement will formalise and become NGOs. And then I think they're beholden to a slightly different master or mistress.
Yeah.
And they become much more fixed, I think. So plans, and they have log frames, and they have all these instruments, which I think in many respects can be a constraint.
Yeah.
The social movements, and you know, now in particular, we see so many different, and I'm calling them entities because I think movements is, as a term, is increasingly becoming co-opted, because I think it's seen as, you know, coming together and joining together and all going for the same thing. But I think within that, the voice of the activists becomes increasingly lost, and I think that is problematic.
Yeah, because I think I might know the article. It might have been Jennifer Lempfer's article. Anyway, I've read. I think it could have been that one. And what I think is interesting is when she's talking about social movements, she sort of reminds us that, you know, that's like people acting for themselves around specific issues, and sometimes I think like development can be like, almost feels like the antithesis of that. It's like people trying to do something to other people, right? Like make their lives better in some sort of, you know, in the worst sense of it, like we're going to save you kind of, and which does sort of hark back to colonialism. And I think, like, how do we unpack that in a way that means we can be in sort of basically in solidarity where it's useful, and, you know, channel resources where it's useful, or whatever the words for that are, without basically being in this hierarchy. So it sort of reminds me of what you said at the beginning, like how do we take that hierarchy out of what we're doing and really be in it? It's kind of, it's quite radical, I think, what that suggests.
But I think now, I mean, we're in really, really fascinating times, and, you know, we can speak to all of the movements of you know, the last 2 years. So Black Lives Matter in the US, Me Too, the various kind of anti-corruption movements that crop up in response to national elections. And I think a movement comes about to respond, like as you were saying, to a particular context in time. And I think the ones that become really high profile, you know, if you strip away that profile and look at the individuals who are behind them, you hear about them sometimes. It's almost like, you know, the one for me which really resonates is the Me Too movement, and all of the work and experience and solidarity that was happening amongst Black women, led by, and, you know, the coining of the phrase by Tarana Burke, which no one had heard about. And even when Me Too really took off, really important, absolutely important, but it took a heck of a long time and a lot of shouting out by Black American women to say, hang on, you know, we absolutely embrace and are delighted that we are now coming together, but don't forget the origins of this initiative, this idea, this experience.
Yeah.
And please don't co-opt it to a point where our voices are no longer front and center, or at least alongside you.
Yeah, yeah, and there's such a tendency for that to happen when, particularly, I think, like, it becomes something that sort of everyone knows about and everyone's doing, but they don't really know anything about the history of it. They just saw it on Facebook or something, right?
Exactly, and more power to Facebook when it's responsible, whenever that is.
Yeah.
But it's there are scores of people who are not part of NGOs who are doing work because they cannot survive unless that work happens.
Yeah.
And I think there that they're going to do it whatever. And I think it's there where this whole concept of a really structured, rigid organization being part of that movement, for me, I find a real struggle to reconcile how they can work as partners. I think they can work in solidarity, but I think the partnership, whatever that is defined, that is where it starts to get a little bit murky.
Yeah, and so it makes me wonder, like, in terms of this thing we call development and where it's at, which is, for the most part, quite a lot of structured organizations that maybe grew out of some sort of desire to make change and then have become quite organized with lots of things going on in them, as you spoke to. Like, what do you think needs to shift if we're to, I guess, be better vehicles for solidarity and maybe less perplexed by these hierarchy problems that seem to kind of plague a lot of what we do?
Sorry, Mary, do you mean in terms of what do we need to do as a sector, or?
Yeah, I think that's what I meant. Yeah, so, like, what are the things that maybe this conversation should make us alert to? Like, what should we be doing differently? I guess that's what I meant. I just had a fancy question.
I think I think of the informal conversations that I've had with friends,
mm-hmm.
with colleagues, with people I meet, by chance in passing.
Yeah.
Who are and I don't want to say there are activists here and then administrators, which is a kind of really sort of a way that I describe the difference between maybe the movement and the organisation.
Yeah.
I think what you were saying about your anthropology,
mm-hmm.
and learning about it needs to be informed by and demonstrate real involvement, and all the leadership by communities, etc. Those I don't think anybody disputes those.
No.
What's happened is, as you said, is that they've just become a kind of process that you say you've done, mm-hmm. as a development organisation.
Yeah.
Arguably, and I was thinking about this yesterday, because I kind of think, I have a look at a lot of websites for organisations who say, we're looking for funding for this. And the websites are all of the pictures on there are, there's an awful lot of what I describe as the happy native picture.
Yeah.
It's, it has to fit a certain profile of, some exotic cloth and maybe a head wrap and a smile kind of thing, or, baby on back, hair over shoulder, that kind of image.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm thinking, who is that speaking to?
Yeah.
So this whole thing about saying we've involved, we want to do some work with women in Tamale, let's say, by way of example.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a focus group discussion, and they said this, that, and the other. And so we're now going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
It feels, for the particular issue that that organisation specialises in, arguably okay-ish.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what happens when you're that rigid is that you've got probably to be quite simplistic. So you can only take on board the things that you can respond to.
Yeah.
And this whole thing about seeing women or girls as the constituent parts of the work that you do, almost.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are and I'll be, just use really sort of obvious examples. So if you're, an organisation that does work in maternal health, there's research that says, there's a problem with the distance from home to clinic.
Yeah.
And the only way a woman can get from home to clinic is if her husband lets her. So we know that we've got to do some work kind of convincing men, something on empowerment and agency. So we'll kind of sort of do that. But fundamentally, it's about getting from home to hospital and making sure when they get to hospital, the quality of the service is good.
Yeah.
So that's that bit of the woman taken care of. And the woman's got a child, so education comes in, and it's all about completing education, again, with a bit of addressing violence, because we know that, there is research that says teachers, transactional sex, etc. So there's all of these compartments that are addressed.
Yeah.
And then I think then in talking about those individual women who have been getting on in life, albeit with some challenges, it's so reductionist.
Yeah.
It's absolutely so reductionist. And then that is how, arguably, if you're a health organisation communicating to your constituents, I think your audience will start seeing these communities as whatever it is you're working on to address and problematizing. And I think with activists who are working, for example, rather on necessarily health, saying budget advocacy and marching to the district administrator's office and saying, there's 10,000 in the budget, but there are no hospital beds or no facilities. When it gets reduced to log frames and, outcome mappings and things like that, you're kind of thinking we're just then going to get trapped in a cycle of only looking at those bits. And activists who work in that space then become associated only with those bits, not as, I would argue, not as whole, living, busy, functional, fragile individuals.
Yeah.
So I think I rambled there. I was trying to remember what the question was.
I don't remember what the question was, but what I do remember, it was kind of, what should we do differently? And what I am hearing is that so much about how we do stuff and how we create projects and programs and pieces of things is tends to be us, as in, an NGO or organisation or whatever it is, coming and saying, we want to work on X. What are your problems with X? Oh, we've involved you in telling us what your problems on X are, and now we're going to involve you in creating a solution. But it's very much compartmentalising someone's life and their whole reality, and it's very reductionist in that sense.
Yes. And just also to add, Marianne, I think there's something about, and it will always be attention, and I don't know the answers. I think it would require such radical refiguring. As development has got more competitive, as, kind of geopolitical imperatives are becoming increasingly more important, whether explicitly or implicitly, in decisions that, say, big multi and bilateral funders are making. There's something about needing, I think, to oversimplify everything. So this slightly speaks to, you know, just the sectoral focus thing.
Yeah.
But there's also, it feels like things have to be packaged in a way that you can compare things which arguably should be dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
And so inevitably, the heart and the soul of what you're trying to, you know, to work, to heal, to make better, and I mean that kind of physically, emotionally, and, you know, psychologically. I think it feels like it's incompatible. You can't look at individuals and communities as really mucky and complex, I think, and respond to that complexity with a model which by its very nature is boxy and rigid and very externally defined.
That makes perfect sense to me. And so what I would wonder is, like, you know, is there alternatives out there, and, you know, that speak to this better? And I guess I'm sort of feeling like they kind of by nature would have to be like something generated from places, you know, like anything that comes and says, what are your problems, feels like that's the first problem, is like asking people, what are your problems? Is the problem.
And we can always find some problems if someone asks us.
Right, if someone comes and asks me my problems, I can tell them, right?
You know what, Marianne, this reminds me of a story my grandma told me. So my grandma grew up in like Eastern Zimbabwe in the 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
And I always remember her telling me, I was about 7 years old, and we were out on the, you know, the family kind of farm that we, you know, and I always remember her saying we were sitting outside the kind of main house, and there was a really long path to the, you know, the main dirt road that ran at the end, and we were sitting outside, and these you know, these folks walked up the path, and there was a kind of mix of, you know, African and white, and they came up, and my grandmother, she looked at me and she said, I think this is the Methodist, so today we talk about water. And it just it sums it up, doesn't it? It's like, oh, it's Wednesday, so it and I think that is slightly the problem. So you're coming with a solution before you know what the problems actually, you know, yes, water might be a problem, but what are the nuances that sit behind that?
Yeah.
And if you sort out the water, there are still much more complex problems that you need to address.
Absolutely. And I love that story.
My grandmother was she was the first feminist, you know, in a really subtle, gentle, but kick-ass, somewhat slightly scary sometimes way, but absolutely. And you know, when you say what does it mean to me, it means memories like that of my grandma, of my mum, of my sisters, you know, and I think that's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, for people listening, like, to try to avoid, or maybe, you know, well, one thing we could say, let's dismantle, you know, that would be the devil's advocate. We should just dismantle aid and development, and that it's one option, right? Do you see other options? Do you see ways that we could improve our practice, and if so, what kind of things do you think those might be?
Well, you know, as you saying that, I was thinking of two examples of things we hope, or sort of, let's call them mechanisms, but, you know, they've got more spirit than that. And so they're a fund which is run out of Mama Cash called the Red Umbrella Fund. Yeah. And the With and For Girls Collective, which is run out of the Stars Foundation. Yeah. And I'm using those because, you know, absolutely, if we were to play devil's advocate, we would say this whole thing needs dismantling and some reflection and rebuilding.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, what can be done to demonstrate that doing things differently, sadly these things are quite radical, but doing things differently can do. So the Red Umbrella Fund is about a fund which funders put, collective funds into, but the decision making is by sex workers around, and the work is addressing sex worker rights.
Yeah.
So those decisions are made by sex workers, and the work is to support sex workers.
Yeah.
And then the With and for Girls Collective is about support to girl-led organisations wherever they are in the world.
Yeah.
And the decisions on what gets funded are made by regional panels of girls and young women in the regions where the work is being proposed. So that, but it sounds so simple.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like exactly the sort of thing that the development sector says is important. But for some reason, there are many more examples, but they are very much in the minority.
Yeah.
So I think they show some shape of how you can be more meaningful and more purposeful in demonstrating the values that you say you have. So they're not just stuck on a wall in an office or in a nice shiny pamphlet with lots of pictures of happy natives.
Yeah.
But they are actually being led by, decided by, argued over by the communities, by the individuals who are doing this work day in, day out, without all the, the machinations that I think are, what constrain the development sector.
Yeah, so it's basically making sure the decision making is happening by people who are closer to the work that's being done, in a way, right?
Yes, and that could be also through kind of funding mechanisms that are of and again, another example is the African Women's Development Fund. And, there's whole conversations in Africa around this concept of Ubuntu, which is a word that's been hideously appropriated
Ubuntu, yes.
Yeah, but in its very essence is about, humanity, and you are human because you are, with and for other humans.
Yeah.
And I think that whole notion of, where I think the sector the development sector adds and has a really important role to play is on advocacy, because a lot of the problems, yes, there are many, but are around, the structure of trade, of the kind of development decisions,
Mm-hmm.
all of these, geopolitical things that play out around, French-speaking Africa will seemingly have the connection to France, and English-speaking Africa will, and it's almost like a kind of, what would I call it? The kind of second scramble for Africa.
Right, absolutely.
And actually, it doesn't necessarily look that different, but there is a kind of veil of benevolence that is disguised by, we're doing it for long-term development.
Yeah.
And it's not to slant, just like the whole development sector. But I think it's really unoriginal because, I'm not as young as I used to be. And I think, if you look at very kind of data numbers on how many girls go to school and so on and so forth, yes, things are improving. But the structural contexts, I think, are really constrained because the relationships externally with former colonial governments or multilateral institutions seem to be stuck in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah.
And so, the kind of very paternalistic attitude. And again, I would argue, when you look at the UK development sector, The fact that there is so little involvement of the communities where the sector is working in making the decisions. And I've been in conversations where my favourite one was being on a telephone and an organisation complaining, hadn't sent something in that they should have, so they didn't get their money. And I said, well, can you talk me through what some of the issues might be? And I swear to God, the probably quite nice white gentleman said, I quote, "Well, Africans." And that attitude, rare, but I would sit in meetings sometime and think it sometimes feels like that kind of assumed power permeating all of the conversations that I'm in.
Yeah.
And I think that is deeply, deeply, after 60 years, you wonder what ways can be, what can be done to change that. And I do think that the shifts in where those decisions around the what, the why, the who, and their cash need to be made. And if mistakes are made, then that's par for the course, because it's not like everything is super effective. It's just more formalized, I think, in the development sector outside of the global south.
Yeah. And I think of when you give that story, I think of the way in which I think outside the sector, and maybe to some extent within it, there's this idea that if you work for an international NGO, somehow you're sort of, I'm going to say good, or like you're there's this kind of, there's something about your benevolence, there's somehow something, terribly sacrificial about it, and then when we see stuff like what's been in the news recently around the Oxfam scandal and the A2 thing and all of that, and we start to sort of see that slightly unraveling in people's imagination. And I just think, there's so much about what I've seen in the sector that really isn't like that, and actually I'm not sure that I want it to be, because actually that kind of benevolence that's very sort of paternalistic, for want of a better word, that makes all these assumptions about what people need and what, and being this kind of like sacrificial person going out to save people somewhere, is part of so much of what's wrong for me. So I kind of want to break that down, and I don't actually quite know what comes in its place, but I feel like it's almost like in the breaking down we figure that out. And I think some of these things that you talked about, like, people making decisions about money in different places, they do feel like some concrete things. And then I also think, like, when that, when you have examples like that of someone saying, well, Africans, and then I feel like also there's that response of like, Africa is a massive continent with so much diversity and so much, it's just not even meaningful to make such a, even if you, to make statements that are generic and general about,
I'm not going to wear my hoodie, my Africa is not a country hoodie.
I know, that's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
But also, Marion, I was just thinking, when with what you were just saying about the stereotype of people who get involved in the the development sector, and I'm talking about the development sector rather than kind of social activism.
Yeah.
And and people go, when people say, where do you work, and I used to tell them, and they would go, oh, you must be a good person. And I would, sometimes I go, yes, I'm lovely. But actually, if I was getting engaged in a conversation, I would say, I didn't join because I'm lovely. I joined because I'm angry. And I think that's one of the things that's different, is that, it's not, for me, it wasn't about doing good. It was because there was a lot of not good. Yeah. And it was about changing that. It was, I'm not saving it. I've barely saved myself.
Right.
But actually, it's about, what? Things are wrong, and that's not right. So, that was always my motivation.
Yeah, I love that distinction, and I actually think that a lot of people, and perhaps not everyone, but a lot of people in the sector come originally from that place. But there's something that happens when we get sucked into all this structure that we maybe lose sight of it a bit. And then there's also that thing of how we as in the sectors present itself to the world with, as you said, the happy natives or the sad natives sometimes, but that whole sort of stereotype of doing good to others, the way we've presented that also doesn't help, and it kind of feeds this idea people have about us being something that we never meant to be, I think. What do you think about, so you spoke about it a bit, and then we kind of moved on to something else, but the sort of lack of diversity in the development sector, say, let's just talk about the UK, but in terms of who's actually there, what do you think about that? What would you say?
It enrages me.
Yeah.
It absolutely enrages me. And I think there's all sorts of things, some of which are related obviously to what we've already chatted about. It's, if you're making decisions about context, about experiences, absolutely, if you do your consultation in country and all of that, and you get that input, absolutely there's value. But I think in even deciding the nature, the different ways of coming at conversations, it sort of perplexes me how you can't see value in bringing in the voices and the experience from those contexts in which you say, you care about and you want to bring about change.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm very struck by, in the UK sector, which is the one that I know most about, there are almost two sectors. Mm-hmm. So there's what are, maybe the expression has changed, but like the mainstream NGOs.
Yeah.
And then the diaspora NGOs. So diasporas, whether it's African or Asian, which just seems ludicrous because you're, the biggest voice, the most well-resourced are not the ones who are of the community.
Yeah.
You just think to yourself, gosh, this is very curious. And I think it just feeds back into that whole notion of decisions being made external and not inclusively. Mm-hmm. And I think where you look at those organisations, I think I understand that as part of the kind of organisational reporting that either this last April or certainly next April, organisations are going to have to talk about or report on diversity in their organisations.
Yeah.
And I think, when I think about having worked in the UK sector for, and I'm going to show my age here, 19 years, maybe nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
Across this, particularly in the grant making sector, if I look now at the organisations that I'm familiar with, I can probably think of about sort of 6 or 7 sort of 6 or 7 ethnically diverse middle managers.
Yeah.
So at the senior levels, at the director levels, there's probably 1. Mm-hmm. And then at the kind of middle management, so even below the decision making, there's probably about 6 or 7. That is not scientific.
No.
But, everybody, you look at jobs that are advertised and everyone goes, we respect, we value diversity. But whether it's in the form that the applications or the interviews are structured, or whether it's just, you know, that thing about recruiting in one's own image, or whether it's about feeling threatened by, you know, maybe a slightly different perspective on things. There isn't. It feels like actually there's probably been a decrease in my experience in the diversity in organisations, and I think from an economic point of view, if you look at the private sector, not that we should always take the lead from the private sector, but there's some really interesting learning around what value diversity brings to the bottom line. So surely when you're value based in terms of, you know, not financial value, but if you're values based, surely, there's an even greater, what's the word I'm looking for? An even well, I would say imperative, but if it's not important, I guess it's not important. But also, there's a word. It'll come to me. But
maybe also, I was thinking like responsibility. Like, I think, and maybe that wasn't your word, but I was just, I was just thinking like, development organisations have, to me, a responsibility to be diverse, more diverse, because like otherwise, how can they possibly do the work in a way that reflects the values that they you know, they put on the top of all their things, you know, around local ownership and all this stuff? How can you then create a structure that doesn't reflect that and expect it to do the job? I think it feels like, what was did you find your word?
No, I didn't. It did make me think, because I think I saw the other day, so there's an award, and I think it's the Charity Commission or some charity governance structure that has an award which is around diversity of organisational leadership, and I think ActionAid UK has just won it. Okay. And you're thinking, in that sector, the fact that you have to have an award to recognise it seems somewhat counterintuitive. You know, it is slightly like you're applauding people for doing what should be fundamental to who they are and what they do.
And we can't claim a lack of availability of people that could do this work. There could be, I suppose. The only thing you might be able to say is that people aren't that interested in doing this kind of work, and then to me that says something about the kind of organisations we are.
I totally agree. Because going back to that sort of activist administrator analogy that we used earlier, you know, the number of, and just from my small sphere and circle of friends, colleagues, relations who are doing, whether it's about going to the embassy and protesting against the lack of diaspora votes in, you know, national elections, whether it's about providing counselling services to refugee women or whatever it is, who are busy. So they go to work 9 to 5 for whoever, and then in the evenings, on the weekends, are working in the community on community issues. So they're working on the issues. Okay. So, and they go home to, you know, if I go to South Africa or Zimbabwe, you know, I'm doing stuff on holiday. And it wouldn't be any other way for me. But then there to be this perception that there aren't the right qualifications in those communities or experiences. It's kind of like the experience of being of the community is valued less than 3 years development studies at a university and a couple of years as a volunteer somewhere. Which, you know, both are valuable, you would say, or could bring valuable experiences, but it seems there's a higher premium on the one than there is on the other. And I would say this isn't just in the UK. I think if you look at the big international organisations or the medium-sized international organisations in many countries, exactly the same things play out.
Yeah, and of course there are isolated examples that we can point to, and we can say, oh, this organisation's done X or Y, or recruited X or Y person that might seem to be different. But I think like it overall, I definitely see that pattern. You know, be it might be anecdotal rather than scientific, but that patterning is there. Like there's way more you know, people who aren't from the communities we're working in organisations, and there is also, I think, more men at the top and more women at the bottom, which also would seem not to reflect our, you know, many of the organisations, you know, prescribed values around women's rights and equity and stuff. So
yeah, absolutely
something is wrong in our structures in my view.
Where to start? I do think there is, and this is where my slight obsession with street art for social justice, because things are not going to change through the existing mechanisms, the informal mechanisms. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of discussion about innovation and disruption in traditionally structured organizations. But that's not where that real disruption is going to happen. It is going to happen in the activist community.
Yeah, in things to the side and things, that aren't called, development. Yes. What? Tell us before we finish, like street art. What's your vision of street art for change? Or I don't know.
Well, I think, and in fact, I'm reading about 4 books at the moment. Sorry, I'm just showing you.
Yeah, please do. Oh, yeah.
But I think it's when I think about the origins of, say, graffiti in New York in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a community that there was something about there being a collective about wanting to change the environment, and to I say lay claim to it, not the environment, but to have a presence in it. And there was something about the fact that it was covert, and you'd wake up one day and things would look different.
Yeah.
And the morphing into the kind of hip hop culture and the communities and the houses and the kind of verbal sparring, which was the non-violent sharing of ideas and discussion, and making it a visual, visualizing it, to get messages out and to get people involved and to get people asking questions. For me, I think is really, really interesting. I think street art has become it's starting to get a little more formal now.
Yeah.
But I think it's very much, I think it's a very, very, very male, pursuit. And I think within that, there are things that are happening, things that are starting, which I hope, and I still have to figure out how it's going, how and what and where I might be able to add anything. But, for me, that's exciting. For me, that's disruptive. For me, that's activist. And for me, I think that is, bringing in different voices, which generally are not heard or are seen as too other to be listened to.
Cool. We'll be watching your street art develop.
Just to be clear, I can't do it. I'm not artistic in that way.
And then finally, I said I'd ask you for a recommendation of township tech. What should we listen to? Like, what 2 things or 3 things should we listen to?
Well, I think for a film, there is a film called The Future Sounds of Mzansi.
Okay.
Definitely that. And I think there's a couple of things about that, because it looks at, music from Black areas, township.
Yeah.
Within the context of the last couple of decades in South Africa.
Yeah.
And I think there is a recognition in that. Why I thought yay is actually there's a recognition that it's not a great space for women. And so there are a few women who are featured, but there is a recognition that, you know, they're doing this anyway and they need to get involved. So I like that one. And you'll see a number of artists. Some of them are slightly controversial for misbehaviour, but you'll see a number of artists in there, most of whom I can recommend. And what else would I recommend? I think watch that.
Watch that. All right, we'll do that.
Context makes you think, actually, I want to understand a little bit about that. I'm going for that. But I also advocate, and the way that I entertain myself probably is you've got to dance to it.
Okay.
Because really get inside, and you know whatever you describe as dancing, that is the music to do it to for me.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to try that out later. Thank you so much, Pontso. Thank you for being with me today and for the conversation and the recommendations.
Thank you, Marianne. So, good luck with everything, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what my other fellow activists have to say on this.
Yeah, cool. I'm looking forward to sharing it all with you too. Take care.
Excellent. You too, Marianne. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Pontso Mafethe, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you think you'd like to spend a little more time with the ideas and suggestions that we discussed in this talk, or any of the others that are part of the Healing Solidarity Conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of the conference and get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more. Thank you.